In the early morning of February 24, 1525, a powerful army stood outside the northern Italian city of Pavia. More than 20,000 French soldiers had marched across mountains and valleys to reach this moment. They were confident, experienced, and led by a king who believed destiny favored him. For weeks they had surrounded the city, certain that its defenders were exhausted, starving, and on the brink of surrender. From the perspective of the French camp, victory seemed only a matter of time. After all, the French army possessed what had dominated European battlefields for centuries: armored knights, elite cavalry whose thunderous charges had broken enemy lines again and again throughout the Middle Ages. As dawn approached, many of those soldiers believed the siege would soon end with a triumphant victory. But hidden beyond the French lines, something unexpected was already unfolding. Under the cover of darkness, an imperial relief force had quietly moved into the wooded hunting grounds near the battlefield. Among the trees stood disciplined infantry carrying a relatively new and unsettling weapon, the arquebus. Compared to the shining armor of mounted knights, these early firearms looked crude. Yet they carried a deadly promise that would soon change the course of the battle. When the fighting erupted that morning, the French cavalry launched a powerful charge, lances lowered and banners flying. For a brief moment, it appeared as though tradition would triumph once again. Then the gunfire began. Smoke drifted through the trees as bullets struck steel armor and shattered the momentum of the charge. Horses fell. Knights collapsed. Within hours, the proud French army would be broken, and its king would find himself a prisoner. That morning at Pavia would mark the moment when the age of knights finally began to fade. To understand why tens of thousands of soldiers eventually clashed outside the walls of Pavia, it helps to step back and look at the world of early 16th century Europe. At that time, northern Italy was one of the most prosperous regions on the continent. Long before the rise of modern nation-states, its cities had already become centers of commerce, banking, and culture. Merchants moved goods across the Mediterranean and through the Alps, bringing spices from the east, fine textiles, precious metals, and countless other products into bustling Italian markets. Wealth flowed through cities such as Florence, Venice, and Milan, and with that wealth came influence. Powerful banking families handled the finances of kings and princes across Europe, while trade networks connected Italy to nearly every corner of the known world. Controlling even a portion of this region meant access to enormous economic power. But Italy in the early 1500s was not a unified country the way we think of it today. Instead, it was a patchwork of independent states, duchies, republics, city-states, and territories ruled by local dynasties. Each had its own government, its own alliances, and often its own rivalries with neighboring cities. Milan, Venice, Florence, the Papal States, and several smaller powers competed for influence, sometimes cooperating but often clashing in political maneuvering and military conflict. This fragmentation created opportunity for ambitious rulers beyond the Italian peninsula. Foreign powers saw the divided landscape as an invitation to intervene. Two of those powers stood above the rest: the Kingdom of France and the vast political entity known as the Holy Roman Empire. Both believed they had legitimate claims to parts of northern Italy, particularly the Duchy of Milan. For decades, their rivalry had drawn them into a series of wars fought across the Italian peninsula. Each campaign brought armies across the Alps, turning Italy into a battleground where the ambitions of Europe's most powerful monarchs collided. For the French king, Francis I of France, control of Milan was more than a matter of prestige. It was a strategic objective with enormous consequences. Holding Milan would give France a powerful foothold south of the Alps and a gateway into the wealthiest regions of Italy. It would also strengthen France's position in the ongoing rivalry with the Emperor, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, whose territories stretched across much of Europe. For Charles V, allowing France to dominate northern Italy would threaten the balance of power across the continent. Milan itself was one of the most important cities in the region. It sat at a crossroads of trade routes linking Italy with France, Switzerland, and the German states. Whoever controlled Milan could influence the movement of armies, commerce, and political alliances throughout northern Italy. In strategic terms, it was a gateway, both a shield and a doorway into the heart of the peninsula. By the early 1520s, tensions between France and the Empire had reached another breaking point. The struggle for Milan had reignited, and both sides understood what was at stake. The campaign that followed would draw thousands of soldiers into northern Italy, ultimately leading them to the fields outside Pavia, where the future of European warfare would be decided in a single, violent morning. By the year 1524, the rivalry for control of northern Italy had reached another critical moment. Determined to reclaim dominance in the region, Francis I of France began preparing for a new campaign that he believed would secure French influence once and for all. Messengers rode across the kingdom carrying royal orders to nobles, commanders, and regional leaders. Each was instructed to gather men, equipment, and supplies. Within months, soldiers from across France began assembling under the king's banner. What emerged was not a small expedition, but a powerful army designed to project strength far beyond France's borders. At the heart of this army were the famed French knights. For centuries, heavily armored cavalry had been the dominant force on European battlefields, and the French nobility prided itself on producing some of the most formidable mounted warriors in the world. Many of these men had trained for combat since childhood. Their armor was carefully forged steel, polished until it reflected the light, and their warhorses were bred specifically for battle, large, disciplined animals capable of carrying both rider and armor into the chaos of combat. When dozens or even hundreds of these knights charged together across open ground, the thunder of hooves could shake the earth itself. Generations of victories had convinced many commanders that such charges were nearly unstoppable. Yet even a powerful cavalry force could not win a campaign alone. Francis I understood that warfare in the 16th century required a balance of different types of troops. To strengthen his army, he hired thousands of Swiss mercenaries, soldiers who had built a fierce reputation throughout Europe. Swiss infantry were known for their discipline and their mastery of the pike, a weapon that could extend more than 12 feet in length. When Swiss formations advanced together, their long pikes created a moving wall of steel that few enemies dared to confront directly. Their presence added a formidable backbone to the French army's infantry ranks. Alongside cavalry and infantry came another essential component: artillery. By the early 1500s, cannons had become a decisive factor in sieges and battlefield engagements. Francis I ensured that his campaign would be supported by powerful siege guns capable of smashing stone walls. Moving these weapons was no simple task. Cannons were massive iron machines mounted on heavy wooden frames, and transporting them required teams of horses, oxen, and dozens of soldiers working together. Wagons filled with cannonballs, barrels of gunpowder, and specialized tools followed closely behind. Supporting this army required a massive logistical effort. Hundreds of supply wagons carried grain, salted meat, tents, spare weapons, and materials needed to repair equipment. Blacksmiths traveled with the army to mend damaged armor and forge replacement parts. Carpenters prepared bridges and siege equipment, while cooks and camp workers handled the daily task of feeding thousands of hungry soldiers. A military campaign of this scale was not just about soldiers. It was an entire moving system designed to sustain war far from home. When everything was finally ready, the French army began its march south. Their path led them across one of Europe's most formidable natural barriers, the towering Alps. Column after column of infantry wound through narrow mountain passes while cavalry guided their horses along steep trails. Supply wagons creaked along rocky roads, and artillery crews struggled to drag heavy cannons over difficult terrain. It was a slow and demanding journey, but the soldiers pressed forward. On the other side of those mountains lay northern Italy and the city of Pavia, where the campaign would soon take a dramatic and unexpected turn. As the French army pushed deeper into northern Italy, their objective gradually became clear. The city that stood in their path was Pavia, a strategic stronghold just south of Milan. Whoever controlled Pavia could threaten the surrounding region and influence the struggle for northern Italy. For the French king, Francis I of France, capturing the city would be a critical step towards securing Milan and strengthening France's position in the long conflict with Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. Inside the city, the first warning signs arrived long before the French army appeared on the horizon. Travelers and merchants moving along the roads of northern Italy brought troubling reports. Large columns of soldiers were marching south, supply wagons stretched for miles, and banners bearing the symbols of France were visible across the countryside. Soon afterward, imperial scouts confirmed the news. A massive army was approaching Pavia, and it was only a matter of time before the city stood at the center of the conflict. The commander responsible for defending Pavia immediately began preparing the city for a siege. Orders spread quickly through the garrison and the streets. The gates were reinforced with heavy wooden beams and iron supports, ensuring they could withstand repeated assaults. Guards were doubled, and watch rotations were tightened so that soldiers constantly monitored the surrounding countryside. No one entered or left the city without strict permission. Attention then turned to the walls. The stone fortifications surrounding Pavia had protected the city for generations, but in the face of an approaching army, every weakness had to be addressed. Soldiers carefully inspected towers, ramparts, and defensive positions. Cracked stone was repaired, wooden fighting platforms were reinforced, and defensive weapons were prepared along the battlements. Archers and crossbowmen were assigned positions where they could fire down on approaching enemies. Alongside them stood soldiers equipped with arquebuses, early firearms that, while slow to reload, were capable of piercing armor at close range. Preparing the defenses was only part of the challenge. If the city became surrounded, survival would depend on the supplies stored within its walls. Farmers from nearby villages rushed carts loaded with grain and produce into the city before the French army could block the roads. Warehouses quickly filled with barrels of wine, salted meat, and sacks of flour. Livestock such as sheep, pigs, and cattle were driven through the gates so the population would have access to food during a prolonged siege. Wells were inspected and cleaned to ensure a steady supply of drinking water. By the time the French army finally arrived, Pavia had transformed from a peaceful city into a fortified stronghold. Soon the fields beyond the walls filled with thousands of soldiers. French banners rose above sprawling camps, and long lines of tents stretched across the countryside. Cavalry patrols rode across nearby roads, cutting off travel and preventing any supplies from reaching the city. The siege had begun. Rather than launching an immediate assault, the French adopted a slower and more calculated strategy. They surrounded the city, isolating it from the outside world. Over time, the defenders would run out of food, and the city would be forced to surrender. Meanwhile, French artillery crews positioned their massive cannons outside the walls. When the order was given, the guns roared to life. Iron cannonballs slammed into stone fortifications, sending clouds of dust and fragments into the air. The sound of artillery echoed across the countryside day after day. Inside Pavia, life grew increasingly difficult. Rations were reduced, and soldiers spent long hours standing guard on cold stone walls while enemy artillery continued to strike the city. At night, the glow of hundreds of campfires outside the walls served as a constant reminder that the French army was still there, waiting patiently for the moment when the city would finally break. For weeks, the French army believed time was on their side. The city of Pavia remained surrounded, its defenders slowly weakening as food supplies dwindled. From the French perspective, victory seemed inevitable. Yet beyond the fields and forests surrounding the city, events were quietly unfolding that would soon shatter that confidence. Far to the north, an imperial relief army had begun moving toward Pavia. The forces loyal to Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, understood that if the city fell, French control over northern Italy would become dangerously strong. Allowing that to happen was not an option. So commanders gathered a mixed force of Spanish arquebusiers, German lanzknecht infantry, and imperial cavalry, all marching with a clear objective: reach Pavia and break the siege. By late February 1525, this army had arrived in the countryside near the city. Rather than rushing directly into battle, the imperial commanders carefully studied the French positions. The French had established camps across the fields and inside a large walled hunting preserve known as Mirabello Park. Dense trees and uneven terrain covered the area, making it difficult for large formations to maneuver, but also offering an opportunity for surprise. On the night of February 23rd, the imperial commanders launched a daring plan. Under the cover of darkness, engineers quietly approached the outer wall of Mirabello Park. Working carefully to avoid detection, they began breaking through a section of the stone barrier. Piece by piece, the wall was dismantled until a narrow opening appeared. Through this gap, the first imperial soldiers slipped into the park. Spanish arquebusiers moved forward through the trees, their early firearms ready. Behind them marched the German lanzknechts, heavily armed infantry known for their discipline and brutal close-quarters fighting. Cavalry followed cautiously, guiding their horses through the breach. All of it happened in near silence while the French army, confident in its siege, slept nearby. Just before dawn on February 24th, everything changed. As the sky slowly brightened, the imperial commanders gave the signal to attack. Suddenly, gunfire echoed through the trees of Mirabello Park. Imperial troops surged forward, striking the French camps from multiple directions. Drums thundered, officers shouted commands, and soldiers rushed to form battle lines amid the confusion. Inside the French camp, chaos erupted. Many soldiers woke to the sound of gunshots and shouting without fully understanding what was happening. Armor was hastily strapped on, weapons grabbed, and units struggled to assemble in the growing turmoil. In the middle of this confusion, Francis I of France quickly mounted his horse and began rallying his cavalry. The French king ordered his knights to charge. Hundreds of armored riders lowered their lances and thundered across the battlefield in a classic cavalry assault. For a brief moment, it appeared that tradition might prevail once again. The initial charge smashed into several imperial units, pushing them backward and scattering infantry formations. But hidden among the trees of Mirabello were hundreds of Spanish arquebusiers waiting for their opportunity. As the French knights advanced, the gunners raised their weapons and fired. The crack of arquebus shots rolled across the battlefield again and again. Thick smoke drifted through the forest as lead bullets struck the charging cavalry. Even the strongest armor had weaknesses, small gaps near joints, visors, and arms. The bullets found those openings. Horses collapsed beneath their riders. Knights were thrown violently to the ground. What had begun as a powerful charge slowly lost its momentum under relentless gunfire. At the same time, another brutal fight unfolded nearby. German Landsknecht infantry clashed with Swiss mercenaries fighting for the French. Both forces were among the most feared soldiers in Europe, and neither side was willing to retreat. Long pikes collided, swords and halberds swung in desperate close combat, and the battlefield filled with smoke, mud, and fallen soldiers. Gradually, the balance shifted. French units became separated in the chaos, and imperial forces began closing in from several directions. Arquebusiers continued firing, while infantry pressed forward relentlessly. The once confident French army began to collapse. Amid the confusion, Francis I continued fighting alongside his knights. But fate soon turned against him. His horse was shot and fell beneath him, leaving the king stranded on the battlefield. Surrounded by imperial soldiers and unable to escape, he was finally forced to surrender. By midday, the battle was over. The French army had been shattered, and the King of France had become a prisoner. When the fighting finally ended outside the walls of Pavia on that cold morning in February 1525, the battlefield told a brutal story. The powerful French army that had marched confidently across the Alps was no longer an organized force. Thousands of soldiers lay dead across the muddy fields, and thousands more had thrown down their weapons and surrendered. What had begun as a calculated siege had ended in one of the most devastating military defeats in French history. At the center of that defeat stood an event that shocked the entire continent: the capture of Francis I of France. A reigning European king had been taken prisoner in the middle of a battlefield, something almost unimaginable in the politics of the time. When the news spread across Europe, courts and governments reacted with disbelief. For decades, powerful monarchs had fought to expand their influence, but rarely had the balance of power shifted so dramatically in a single morning. Yet the meaning of the battle reached far beyond the fate of one king or one army. The events at Pavia revealed something much larger taking shape on European battlefields. For centuries, Heavily armored knights had represented the pinnacle of military power. Their courage, wealth, and training defined warfare during the Middle Ages. But at Pavia, disciplined infantry and gunpowder weapons had proven capable of defeating even the most elite cavalry. The rise of firearms signaled a new chapter in military history, one where technology and organized infantry would gradually replace the dominance of mounted knights. The victory also strengthened the position of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, whose influence now stretched across much of Europe. His triumph at Pavia reshaped the political landscape and ensured that the struggle for control of Italy would continue for many years. Stories like this remind us how a single day can quietly redirect the course of history. If you enjoy exploring moments like the Battle of Pavia, where strategy, leadership, and technology collide to shape the future, consider supporting the channel. Subscribe for more deep historical stories, share your thoughts in the comments, and join us as we uncover the remarkable events that changed the world.